So I have a big question for you. As Dean of Harvard Medical School, what would you say to patients and even some politicians who assert that everybody has a right to try experimental, unproven therapies before they get FDA approval? I'm Insoo Hyun, a bioethicist and philosopher and director of life sciences at the Museum of Science. Today, my guest is George Daley, Dean of Harvard Medical School and a renowned stem cell researcher. Today, we chat about patients' right to try experimental therapies. Is it dangerous? Is it the right choice for patients? Well, George, it's wonderful to have you. Thank you for coming. We've known each other for quite a while, but you've been dean for the last few years, and that's been a big change.
You know, after having been a scientist and a clinician, also involved in public policy to some extent, where we've interacted extensively, it's a sea change. It's a very, very different set of responsibilities.
You and I have done lots of work in the policy area for stem cell therapies and translating basic stem cell biology and discoveries into patient cures. So we all know about the hype around that. There are ways that exciting new developments can get to the public, so to speak, the patient population in the right way, and there are like bad ways where that happens. There has been a phenomenon called stem cell tourism over the last several years. And could you just explain to our audience kind of what, from your point of view, what that sort of encapsulate that phenomenon? What do you think is going on there?
Stem cell tourism is something that really embodies this notion that patients will travel any distance, they will pay any cost, they will really accept almost any risk if it carries with it the possibility of the relief of suffering. And that's something that's been played upon for millennia. I mean, they're going way back to the snake oil salesman. The idea that someone is offering you a miracle cure is incredibly engaging, and it's unfortunately also subject to, very, very perverse distortions of the physician-patient relationship, or the relationship that any vulnerable individual has with someone who's offering them hope for a better life. And so what has been a problem for stem cells in particular, and I don't think stem cells are any different from any of the prior waves of supposed miracle cures, whether, we can go back to Laetrile and all the treatments for cancer. It's simply preying on the vulnerable. And that's the sad reality. And so it's something I know that we've worked on together. It's something that you've got tremendous expertise in as well. And I've been deeply, deeply, profoundly influenced by a paper that you wrote on the notion of spiritual distress. The idea that patients are seeking something that we don't often have an answer for in modern medicine. So you were the one who came up with spiritual distress. I mean, where did you think of that? And when was that something that you had felt yourself?
That was an interesting paper to write because, first of all, I got it into a scientific journal. It had the word spiritual distress in the title. And the editor said, what is this?
Cell,
It was Cell Stem Cell.
It's a leading journal.
You're right. And so I got the idea in the following way. I was answering emails from desperate patients. Even I got emails, let alone like clinicians and stem cell scientists. I know you get emails all the time from desperate patients. I got emails, and one person said, this is a person in Italy. He said, my son has got a degenerative brain disorder. Dr. Hyun, I'm thinking of taking him to a clinic in Moscow. And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, I hope it's not that clinic where that Israeli boy got tumors in his central nervous system from fetal stem cell transplants. But anyway, he said, I'm thinking of taking him to Moscow. What do you think about that idea? And so I answered the way I normally answer those kinds of emails. I gave information, and I even attached the International Society handbook for patients that we helped develop. And I normally answered in the typical way of here's information. And I thought, I'm going to do something different this time. I'm going to do something I hadn't done before. I typed at the very end of that email, if you're asking me what I would do if I were you, I wouldn't go to Moscow with my son. I would spend whatever time I have left doing what he wants to do. Hit send. And that was the first time I ever got a response from somebody. The next morning he emailed me back and he said, Dr. Hyun, I was afraid you were going to say that, but I think you're right. And I was thinking about that for a while, and then I ran into the chaplain at University Hospitals in Cleveland. And on our way to an IRB meeting, he asked me, well, how are things with you? What's going on? And I told him what happened with this email. And he was the one that said, oh, yeah, that family is in spiritual distress. And I said, well, what is this? Well, that was an interesting notion. He told me, oh, yeah, oncologists and pediatricians, people in nursing, people have written about this phenomenon of people falling into a kind of spiritual distress where they lose meaning, and like looking forward to the next day. They start losing hope. And the antidote for spiritual distress is this kind of therapeutic hope, like pinning your hope on kind of like the Hail Mary, right? And I was really fascinated by that dynamic. So I looked up, that literature, and I thought, this is really a missing element to the stem cell tourism phenomenon. Everybody thinks that the way you have to respond to this kind of desperation is give people more information. But what if the people don't need more information? They need emotional support or some other kind of social support. And so I wrote the paper basically making that point. And I think that's a pretty highly cited paper for that kind of bringing that new idea from other areas of medicine into kind of the stem cell discourse.
Traditionally, physicians haven't been taught, or it's thought not to be scientific, to appeal to these notions of spirituality or to meet the needs of patients when it can't be delivered in the form of a pill or a surgery or something like that. There's a wonderful book written by Jerry Grootman, who's a physician, hematologist, oncologist, who's obviously cared for many, many desperate patients. He was one of the leading figures in the early AIDS era. But he's written a book called The Anatomy of Hope. In it, he describes the distinctions between false hope, which is the problem that plays into patients' vulnerabilities and makes them subject to the siren call of these folks who are offering false hope and contributes to stem cell tourism. But what you really want to convey to your patient is true hope. And that doesn't always mean I have something in my treatment armamentarium which is going to cure you. I can't necessarily give you the false hope of cure, but I can give you true hope about things that address the spiritual needs, the personal needs of comfort and interactions with loved ones. As a hematologist oncologist myself, I've had many conversations with patients where one had to talk about the tremendous relief of suffering that doesn't come through medicine but comes through spirituality.
Yeah, and just to be clear, by spirituality, we don't necessarily mean religion.
Doesn't have
Some
to be
people
religion.
get spirituality through religion, other people get it through the connection to nature or to the arts or music, to one another, to family, to community.
Very
So
good point.
spirituality is a broader notion than just a religious doctrine. In fact, the chaplain I had mentioned, he told me, Insoo, in my 20 plus years to being a chaplain at university hospitals, you know how often religious doctrine came up in a conversation with the patient? He said, maybe 5 times. What they want is they want someone to sit down with them, hold their hand and say, okay, what do you need? That's spiritual care. So I'm really curious, are there efforts at Harvard Medical School to kind of get a little bit more of that into the training of future doctors?
There seems to be an uptick in interest in the nature of medical training. There's a bit of a tirade underway by this organization called Do No Harm that seems to think that somehow we've gotten away from the core curriculum of medicine, which is biochemistry and anatomy and pathology and all of that, because medical schools have introduced notions of the social context of disease, the social determinants of health, the critical interface of spirituality, the appreciation of structural racism as an element that contributes to disease and the like. Now, of course, medicine continues to accumulate information. It becomes increasingly impossible for any single individual to absorb and be able to even manage the huge onslaught of information. I mean, if we use the metaphor of drinking from a fire hose, I mean, it's like this is a waterfall, you know,
Right.
and yet it's absolutely essential that our students receive an education which isn't purely the sort of basic science of medicine and disease. Physicians practicing today have to understand the social determinants of health. Think about COVID. COVID brought out in stark relief the interface of poverty, overcrowding, lack of access to medicine, and the burdens of of SARS-CoV-2. So medicine medical education has had to evolve, and it's a challenge, but we have to understand how we can prepare our students to be not just scientists, but compassionate and empathetic.
So we're at Harvard Medical School, and this place reminds me of Starfleet Academy, George. And you're like Captain Picard, ushering in the next generation of science learners, scientific explorers, and doctors. I'm wondering, you went to medical school here, and how much has the medical school changed since you were a student?
I would say the change has been dramatic. It's still the same great fundamental education about anatomy and physiology and all, but medicine has progressed at such a lightning pace. So much more information now that the students have to integrate, and especially all of the social context of medicine, the social determinants of health. You know, we saw in the COVID pandemic that was every bit as important in understanding the ravages of the virus as the anatomy of the molecular coronavirus. So we now have education on the sort of cultural context of disease. We think about issues of health equity and social justice. Those are equally as important as anatomy and physiology and biochemistry, but it makes for a very crowded curriculum.
Right. Well, it must be amazing to see that change in the institution from your time here as a student and now as dean. But those are just such important topic areas. I'm so glad that you're putting a light on those.
It's a deeper and a richer education. Another major difference between when I was in school and today is the use of educational technologies. For instance, we now incorporate a lot of simulation. I mean, you know, when airplane pilots are learning, they're ideally not learning in the cockpit, they're in a simulator. And now we have our medical students doing important interventions in a simulated setting where they can be observed, they can be critiqued, given feedback without having a real patient put at risk. So that's a major, major advance. We've also incorporated a lot of technologies like virtual reality, augmented reality, and we anticipate that that's going to become even more prominent in the future.
So this really is like Starfleet Academy, is what you're saying.
Well, who knows where it's going to be 150 years from now.
I'm glad you brought up the COVID experience because in a lot of ways that also shined a light on patients' access to experimental therapies, things that have not been yet approved by the FDA. We saw that in sharp relief during the COVID pandemic. Now, just so our viewers understand, the FDA already has a process in place since the 1970s called expanded access that gives patients, through the recommendation of their physician, access to therapies or drugs that are in development, they're in the pipeline, they're in the sort of FDA clinical trials process, but have not yet been approved by FDA. And this is a groundbreaking approach. You know, you have to get permission, obviously, from the company developing the drug or the product, of course. So with their permission, FDA can allow the release of this investigational product just for, you know, a few patients or a small group of patients who have a very serious medical condition. Now, apparently, there are groups of people who are unhappy with that policy. They don't think it goes far enough. And so now what you've seen since 2018, we have the Federal Right to Try Act. So they call it the Right to Try. And patients have driven this, but actually mainly politicians have driven it at the state level, but now there's the federal policy. And so what this policy says, we're going to sidestep entirely the FDA. And in some ways, okay, that's more liberal, but in a lot of ways, it's more strict than the original expanded access policy because it's for people who are about to die. So it's not just seriously ill, but like on death's door. So it's more stringent that way. And it's only for individual patients, one at a time. You can bypass the FDA and get direct access, of course, with the company's approval. So the company's still the gatekeeper. So there's been great interest in this idea of getting your hands on the latest, greatest. If it's at Harvard Medical School or being developed by people in spin-off companies from Harvard Medical School, they must have the greatest, newest thing. I have a big question, and that is, as Dean of Harvard Medical School, what do you say to patients and even some politicians who say individuals have a right to try, meaning they get access to, a whole host of investigational unproven therapies without any FDA input? Do you think there's such a right to try?
This is such a complicated question, and I wish there were easy sound bites. Right to try is itself a very seductive, easy soundbite. I just want to give it a shot. I want to have a chance. I want hope. And the problem is that so much of what drives right to try is the false hope. It's not true hope. You talked extensively about the FDA, and the FDA it's a punching bag. It's easy to criticize the FDA. I happen to have worked closely with many people within the FDA, and I can tell you they are just as eager as anybody to approve breakthrough medicines, to make sure that they're pushing the envelope and doing it as fast as possible. But they also understand how difficult it is to find a new medicine that really works. It's hard work. Harvard Medical School knows that. Our whole community is devoted to the idea that we need to discover new elements of biology. We need to translate it into the development of new medications. And we need to be able to introduce it into patients safely and effectively. And that often takes years, if not decades. But the problem is people are desperate. People are vulnerable. People are sick and they want a chance at something. And the problem is it takes longer to explain why there are risks inherent in trying something. I've seen patients who have been desperate. They've been at a terminal stage of their disease, and they've tried something which has accelerated their demise and exacerbated their suffering. It doesn't come for free. It comes at a cost and a risk. And I'm particularly concerned because I'm at Children's Hospital. The number of times parents will take that risk for their kid, that is particularly troublesome because when it's a condition that I know really cannot realistically be helped by whatever stem cell intervention or snake oil might be being offered, I know that the risk of pain and suffering is worse, and it's a desperate situation.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the point about pediatric cases because often that libertarian argument about this is the patient's body, this is their money, let them do what they want with it, works best, if it works at all. It works best when the person assuming the risk and making all the decisions is the same person.
Right.
But what if
and is capable of making
capable of
a
making
thoughtful and informed decision.
That's right. Right. But in other cases, in many cases, it's parents that are desperate and they're seeking a cure for their very young child, which is troubling because it could actually make their condition worse or
But there's another element, even for well-educated, sophisticated patients, it's very difficult to be certain that they understand the risk and benefit. There is this tendency, you've taught me about, the therapeutic misconception, which can undermine the integrity of clinical interventions. Attempts to test whether a drug or a treatment really works, and we say to the patient, you have to know that, this could be risky and it may not help. But oftentimes that patient carries the false hope, and it leads to a therapeutic misconception, and they're willing to accept risk. Maybe they're not perfectly well informed.
You had mentioned false hope and real hope. There are other really fascinating dimensions of hope that I think are at play here. So some of the literature that I read in preparation for the article that I wrote on spiritual distress and hope. Hope is very active for patients. So it's not like wishful, passive, like thinking. I hope someday I'll get better, but it's very active. So in that case, hope has a certain structure. Number one, you have some goal in mind, right? I want a cure, I want to ameliorate my condition, or I don't want to be a burden on the family. So you have some goal. And then you identify a pathway to that goal. That's step number two. And then number three is I am empowered to follow that pathway. It's within my range of power to do so. And so you get those three elements. If you knock away one of them, you better replace it with something else. Otherwise, you may fall into despair or they'll seek another avenue. So if a doctor just says to their patient, oh, don't go to Moscow, it's not going to work, so they close the pathway. You better open up another one. You better say, well, what really is your goal? If you don't want to be a burden, let's explore other ways that you could be empowered to follow that. Especially parents. They don't want to feel like they're just giving up on their child. Like they feel like I have to do something. So it's that kind of like self-activation part of it. It's not wishful thinking. It's goal seeking and pursuit. Super intentional, right?
Yeah.
And so that in some ways it's almost like an indictment against some traditional medicine or even doctors' relationships with patients that they're not getting that kind of they're not getting fed that desire for like being actively participating in control over what's happening to them, and that's the fear of losing control, I think.
I think we have to remind ourselves that medicine has had its heyday in the last century or so. Life expectancy has more than doubled since 1900, and it's in large measure because of public health interventions, clean water, vaccines, antibiotics certainly. We don't have the burden of infant mortality that we used to have, and all of that is wonderful. And medicine is progressing at an enormously rapid pace, and yet it feels like it's almost getting more and more difficult to get the breakthroughs because we really have a rich and mature medical system. So it's really important for patients to understand how difficult it is and how unlikely it is that somebody can simply say, oh, I know this works, let me give it to you. And it's that kind of anecdotal, oh, I've seen it work, trust me, it's going to work, that we saw happen in the early days of the pandemic. I mean, people were desperate for some intervention that would cure the patient. Patients were dying, and they were willing to listen to things like, oh, chloroquine must work, ivermectin must work, X, Y, Z. And the reality is, when we subject these anecdotal sort of observations to really rigorous, blinded, randomized types of analysis, ivermectin doesn't work, chloroquine doesn't work. We have to be humble as physicians, and we have to be receptive as patients to realizing how difficult it is to prove that something works.
So when the general public thinks about medical professionalism, their thoughts immediately go to the Hippocratic Oath. But you and I know that the Hippocratic Oath is so outdated, right? Because it says
a couple thousand years old.
You're not supposed to teach women the medical arts. You're not supposed to charge tuition. You're not supposed to use a knife. We know there are knives all over the place here at HMS,
well, to
right?
cut out stones, right? I've never seen a bladder stone. But anyway.
So people have this idea that the doctors at graduation, give an oath to society. It's not the Hippocratic Oath, but here at Harvard Medical School, do the students have their own oath that they offer at graduation?
They do. In fact, there's a whole committee that works on the construction and the sources ideas from lots of other students, and they read it collectively with us sort of leading the oration at their graduation ceremonies.
Yeah.
So it's an oath that much more modern than the Hippocratic oath. We aren't swearing to any healing gods or anything like that, but it really espouses the standards of professionalism, the deep commitment to selfless service, the critical importance of health equity, treating everyone without regard to their status, and deep principles of medical beneficence and non-maleficence, patient integrity and confidentiality. The principles are the core ones that should drive the professionalism of all physicians.
Right. Well, the two elements we do still keep from the Hippocratic Oath is to do no harm and to protect patient confidentiality. But I think most of the rest of it we could do away with and adopt more modern standards.
That's absolutely right. I think this issue of health equity, it dovetails with the changes in our medical curriculum as well. The students understand and appreciate that they are advocates and agents of change to achieve one of the highest goals of medicine, which is to deliver expert, compassionate care to all.
Can you give us an example, maybe from the stem cell field, of how challenging it was for a success story to be a success story? You can even get a little bit into the weeds here, because some people might just say, "Oh, look, they're just being way too negative here." Or they're but no, there are some great technical little details about why we have to be so careful.
Yeah. Well, in my own field of hematopoietic transplantation, bone marrow transplantation, that takes us back to the 1950s, to some very pioneering studies done by Don Thomas. He had the notion that patients with leukemias and lymphomas it was a death sentence. And we knew that at the time, because of tremendous interest in the impact of radiation in the aftermath of the nuclear bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we knew that radiation and certain kinds of chemotherapy could wipe out the bone marrow, and it could wipe out the leukemia. What Don Thomas discovered was, if you have leukemia, I could potentially cure your leukemia, but I would give you radiation and chemotherapy. I could eradicate your leukemia, but I eradicate your normal blood-forming system as well. But I could transplant the blood-forming system from a sibling into you, and it might grow and take, and we could have you survive. Well, the first 10 or 12 patients that he treated all died a terrible and painful death. And it was actually Don Thomas himself who realized, I don't know enough about the biology to make this work. I've got to go back to the laboratory, and he did. He went back to the laboratory, started doing experiments in dogs, and then discovered this idea that we actually had to have tissue matching. Randomly, occasionally, your sibling would work because they have about a 25% chance that they match your tissue. But then he could do the extensive tissue matching, started to do human clinical bone marrow transplantation, and became successful and won the Nobel Prize. Now it's 70 years later, 65, 70 years later, and this is among the most successful stem cell therapies. We can treat and cure, not in all instances, we're still doing research, but we can treat and cure leukemias, lymphomas, genetic diseases of the blood and bone marrow. But it took decades of painstaking effort, lots of failure, lots of death, but it's now in place. We hope that modern medicine is quicker than decades, but in many cases, we have to do the hard work.
I should point out to the audience that there are actually two big roads to the clinic for new innovations. One is through the clinical trial system, FDA oversight, and all that. So you got trial, phase 1, 2, 3, et cetera. Then there's also medical innovation outside of a clinical trials context. So a lot of off-label prescribing of medications have developed that way. Surgical innovations have developed that way. So it's not through a clinical trial system, but trying to do the little tweaks on patient care, and over time you get clinical experience and it becomes proven. What do you think should be a responsible way to do that second route, right? The medical innovation route. So Harvard Medical School is a massive medical innovator. Are there people there that kind of take that other route? And what does that other route look like?
Medicine has had a, a history going back thousands of years. And a huge part of medical history is really about diagnosis and prognosis. It's only been rather recent that we've been able to have a real impact in therapeutics, in actual interventions that change the natural history of disease. So what you're positing is, we haven't gotten there just by all clinical trials. There's been a lot of medical intuition. There's been a lot of observation. People chewed on the bark of a tree and they figured out that, oh my God, their fever went down and their pain was relieved. Well, we later knew that was aspirin, right? And there was a deep history of herbal and natural products that were drugs. The Chinese pharmacopoeia is thousands and thousands of natural chemicals and herbs and things. So much of medicine has actually evolved through careful observation of disease, trial and error approaches to treatments, and not all has emerged through this very rigorous clinical trials pathway. And yet we've learned through many mistakes that anecdote and trial and error is error prone. There are many examples, whether it's hormone replacement therapy for postmenopausal women, thinking it would reduce cardiovascular disease and the like. Anecdote and observation, while it can lead to medical innovation, is also fraught with error. And so, as much as possible, when we do medical innovation, it should be done with informed consent for the patient. It should be done on a small number of patients. And only after there's a reasonable clinical hypothesis that my intervention and my observation suggests that there's a positive outcome, that we should move from this purely medical innovation pathway to something that would be aiming at creating a more generalizable knowledge that can be evidence-based and can be promulgated to the masses. That's why the clinical trial program is sort of been established.
The word profession and professional has so much weight, but you can't just use it willy-nilly, right? There are people who might want to say, I'm a professional carpet cleaner, and they'll put professional on the side of their truck. But the real professions, the original four, were law, medicine, divinity, and academia. And when you think about those four original professions, it was really meant to be in service to a very important societal need. The legal needs of a society, the spiritual needs, the medical, the knowledge needs. So you can't just call yourself a profession and just be a profession just because you want to. So this idea of a profession being a service to society is still one that I hope we can remind people of. And I think, as you would agree, medicine continues to be that calling. It's a service to society. It's not just a way to make money. In fact, Plato very famously once wrote that as soon as a doctor trains his or her mind on making money, he functions as a moneymaker and no longer functions as a doctor.
I think in its highest aspirations, medicine is a calling. And indeed, nowadays, there are a lot of other ways that the top college graduates can go on and make a lot more money. Physicians still do extraordinarily well, but they're no longer at the top of the economic food chain. But the core drive of the best physicians is still the desire to help others. And they do feel it's a calling. I think it's a deep and respected aspect of the profession. You're there for the service of your patients. Now, we know that medicine has many faults and many foibles, and those ideals are sometimes not met. But the physician should be treating the patient without regard to the patient's ability to pay. We know that that can be corrupted. It should be in the best interest of the patients at all time, free of the conflict of interest of the physician's own needs. That means that, in tradition, physicians have been on call, sometimes 24/7. if they get called out in the middle of the night or interrupted from a family event, they're there for the service
Well,
of the
and we
patient.
saw during the COVID pandemic that not only physicians, but nurses and other hospital staff were putting their own well-being at risk of going in and meeting that call for service. And I think back in the day when medicine was first starting out, there was much greater risk of dying from catching diseases from your own patients. So this idea of it being a calling can be a little bit easy to forget over time because we normally are not in these pandemic-like situations. But it really came out in the past few years.
Absolutely. Many of the health professions beyond medicine, as you mentioned, nursing, the respiratory therapists, the folks who were really on the front lines during the pandemic, they showed their mettle because they were there for the greater good of the community. And the patients in front of them, the patients they cared for, patients whose lives they saved, that really, I think, reminded us all of the importance of this as a calling.
I think that some of the people who provide these fraudulent stem cell therapies and call themselves doctors in these clinics providing fraudulent stem cell based medicine to the patients are actually turning their backs on the oath of the profession and on the commitments that all doctors should make toward the best interests of their own patients.
I think if you focus on what are the core principles, the ethical principles that guide the physician, a lot of these stem cell clinics, these practitioners who are pushing snake oil and unproven interventions, they fail. They fail necessarily on acting in the patient's best interest. If they're offering unproven and oftentimes faulty kinds of interventions, especially if they're charging for them and they know they're unproven.
That's the moneymaker bit of it.
That's exactly right. This is this idea that their own financial conflict of interest is not in the best interest of the patient. Right. I think it's one of the core principles of medicine today that you practice evidence-based interventions. And if there is no evidence, then of course in the realm of innovative care or experimental medicine, there are principles that guide the use of that as well. The patient who's receiving that should be well informed, and they should know the risks and whether there is any potential for benefit. Oftentimes it's unknown. And they should be able to give their informed consent. And in many instances, these unproven interventions really take advantage of the patient's vulnerability. They may say they're giving their consent, but they're fundamentally operating under a therapeutic misconception.
Right.
We've talked about this before.
Well, when you think about the original professions, there was always a need, and you had a vulnerable population that was being served. People who couldn't defend their own legal interests, people who didn't have the knowledge to advance, medicine or advance other fields. So it was on the responsibility of the expert to look after the other person's best interests. That's why you can't just simply call yourself a profession just because you feel like it and want to make money. It actually has to have that power imbalance and a responsibility that comes with that power imbalance.
Absolutely. There is an asymmetry of knowledge. There is an asymmetry of power, if you say. And so it's up to the physician to take the personal responsibility to act in the best interest of the patient. And when that happens, it really does elevate medicine to the highest ideas.
To a calling. I want to conclude with some thoughts on medical professionalism, and just to get back to the right to try terminology. I don't even think it's well named. It's not right to try, it's right to ask. You have a right to ask your doctor for help. You have a right to ask the company for access to their investigational product, which, by the way, apparently very few companies will allow access outside of any kind of FDA involvement. I mean, they're trying to get FDA approval. Do you really think that these companies are going to tell the FDA, well, this time we're going to go around you and help these patients, so to speak, and then we'll come right back to you and seek approval? That's not a very good relationship you want to build with the FDA. But in any case, there's a right to ask. And I think typically the answer is no.
Or a right to demand, maybe, is another way to think about it.
Right. But the rights come in different flavors. In philosophy, we call them positive rights and negative rights. The negative right is the right to pursue something without other people interfering. So minimally, it might be that kind of right. I have a right to try to do something for myself without you interfering. But what we're talking about here is medical therapies. That's a positive right. That's a right to something, to somebody's help, to have somebody provide you with something you want. Those are very different types of rights. in the positive right realm, I mean, that involves medical professionalism, medical judgment of the treating physician. They have
Right.
to agree with you. It has to be a shared decision between you and the doctor that this is really in your best interest. And given the track history of how very few people have actually used the right to try law, whether it's the federal version or the state version, I think a lot of doctors are saying, hold on a minute, maybe this isn't a great idea. Or the companies will say, we're not going to give you access to this stuff before FDA approval. We want to get FDA approval. We don't want to get in trouble down the road. So medical professionalism, I think, could be kind of a protective, right? A little bit, right? To tamp down, ideally, some over-enthusiasm by the patients or demands by them, unrealistic expectations. How, in the medical school context, do you think you teach the students to become professionals when they
Yes.
leave? How does that transition happen?
I take great pride in our educational system. We're really fortunate that we recruit and attract outstanding, earnest students who want to be committed to a life of service of the patient. And what we do is we empower them with this enormous fund of knowledge, but they have the responsibility to use that knowledge in the service of their patient. And the physician-patient relationship is one of trust, and it's one of protection. Yes, because there's an asymmetry of knowledge here. And as we've talked about with the right to try or the therapeutic misconception, oftentimes a patient who's in a vulnerable state may not be as discriminating in their thought process. They may not be able to judge the risks and the benefits. They may outweigh one or the other, and it's a physician who's charged with being a steward of that process. Now, when it comes into the realm of an actual clinical trial, then you have an even more elaborate oversight mechanism. You have an institutional review board, which sits and reviews the protocol and determines the risk-benefit kind of analysis. And then when it gets to the federal level, we actually have a Food and Drug Administration, which is charged with protecting the patients and making sure that we have safe and effective medicines on the market. I think it's a system that works, but it does all come back to the fundamental trust that the physician and the patient have together.
Well, I think you have some really unique insights here, given your track history of just being an outstanding researcher, but also a compassionate physician, and now a leader in medical education. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Privileged, Insoo. Thank you.